Reformation. That means we have been through the Dark Ages. We have been through the Middle Ages. We have been through very long and difficult, winding road. In your notes, we're going to basically cover lesson 1 and lesson 2 in this lesson. And since we've been through a lot of the stuff about what's been going on in church history, I'm not going to go through the overview in lesson 1, the state of theology. I think you've kind of gotten the picture, bad, or as the theologic term, That's the theologic term that applies to where things are. We know that there has been the little dawn of several different facets of learning, of attempting to study, of getting new literature, academic learning has increased. All the different dynamics that we've seen open up the opportunity to do things and to learn. But what it always ends up taking is some kind of catalyst. And before we get to the main topic of Martin Luther, we're going to talk about Luther this week and talk about his theology next week. So we're going to sort of break it up sort of historically, how he begins stuff, and then theology next week. But before we get to that, I want to just bring up one gentleman. His name is Erasmus, is referred to as Erasmus of Rotterdam. If you remember in our last lesson, we looked at the idea of the Renaissance and humanism. And again, the humanism that's being spoken of at this time is not, the secular humanism that we talk about today. So when you hear the word humanism, this is people who are learning and studying the literature and writings. It's the humanities, if you will. Okay? So a humanist of that time is somebody who is studying the humanities, and in particular the humanities of antiquity, of Roman and Greek writers, philosophers, even a lot of the stuff of the church fathers, even just studying what's going on from the things in the past. And the gentleman who is the most noted from this time is the gentleman named Erasmus of Rotterdam, and naturally he's from Rotterdam because that's kind of where he hails from. And most of these humanists were good folks trying to do good things as good people, but not necessarily God's way. It's kind of moralism. They see evil. Well, evil needs to be fixed. Well, let's go fix evil. We need to philosophically think about things. Now, were some of them theologians? Yes. Erasmus was actually a Catholic priest. But he was not a priest as a monk, a priest as a priest. He was priest as an academic. And that's one of the traditions that you see comes out of the Renaissance and some of the Middle Ages is you start seeing this diversification. He would be what you would consider in our day like a seminary professor kind of person. So, they're theologians, they study stuff, but they're not pastors per se, they're not monks, they're not whatever. So Erasmus would kind of fit into that category. But he was an extremely brilliant man, had a lot of desire to see Reformation in the church. He was referred to as the Prince of the Humanists. Actually, that's if you ever hear that expression, the Prince of the Humanists, that's Erasmus of Rotterdam. He visits England and to learn Greek and understand it better, because one of the things that we're going to see about Erasmus is a guy who gives us the first, I'll call it critical, at that time critical, in our book more semi-critical, Greek New Testament as a basis, which the translations that you see of the Geneva Bible, the King James Bible, etc., there's updates to it, of course. But Erasmus is the guy who sort of pulls all this ancient literature together and does some, hey, that's not quite right, maybe it actually says this kind of stuff. But being a good Catholic, he also had to be very careful about not violating the Latin Vulgate, and when he picked texts, there's actually a text, I believe it's called Minuscule 61, it was found in a monastery in either Ireland or Scotland, someplace up in the northern monasteries, up in those areas, that actually puts those three heavenly witnesses in 1 John. And he put that in there because that got in the Vulgate, and he said, it's not in any Greek text, so somebody found him a Greek text, but it was almost a contemporary text. He said, okay, there's a Greek text. He stuck it in there, because otherwise he was going to say, nah, that's not real. By the way, it's still in your Bibles today. Hopefully it has the nice little bracketing around it that says, this probably isn't real. So just be careful, because it probably isn't. He also went and interacted with some people that we've looked at before, the Brethren of Common Life. And these kinds of people would be the folks that we would see as sort of the beginners of modern devotion. Devotionals and devotional to Christ and that kind of stuff. We mentioned Thomas à Kempis. These type of people today. It would be more like the folks that are reading Morning and Evening by Spurgeon, a devotional. So that kind of folks. He was also contemporary, of course, as Luther was, with Henry VIII. This, by the way, is the time of Henry VIII, and Thomas More, people like that. He also was a guy who was influenced, as most of the humanists were, by the Stoic and Platonic writers, so Neoplatonic thought. So the scriptures through these guys start being looked more and more. They've already been, but they're looking more and more through the lens of the Stoicists and in particular, Plato. So again, that's the framework from interpretation versus pulling out. They read in. And so there's going to be some challenges with that. He, however, did believe that reform was necessary in the church. Some of the doctrines that he looked at in the scriptures, he's saying, we don't look like that, guys. We need to straighten ourselves out, which is a fair thing. All of us need to reflect and say, where is my life? How am I living it? No matter who you are. Well, as we know from our previous history, the papacy, the popes, the priests, the bishops, etc., aren't really interested in that. Not all of them. Some of them are very interested in that. Matter of fact, most of the guys down at the priests are kind of like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do, but so okay, I'll follow what I'm being told. But they were frustrated. The people were frustrated. He realized that many of them can debate real well, but they did not really understand what the words they were debating actually meant. And they certainly didn't live them out. He did hold some of the Catholic views and Catholic doctrines, which we would consider errant, like the perpetual virginity of Mary. The Marian stuff. We haven't talked about this, but it's just grown from Mary, the mother of God, or the mother of Christ. And remember, way, way, way back, they were arguing here. By here, we're getting to the point where, is Mary going to help us with salvation? And is she perpetually virgin? I mean, the doctrine, even a good Catholic theologian will tell you there is no biblical foundation for it. It just sort of begins and builds. So they're very honest about that, but they still teach it. And at this particular time, he still held to that. He, again, updates some of the Greek text to match the Latin Vulgate as opposed to what the actual text would have told you when they get all these texts. So, again, he has to kind of go along with things. But he did realize that formalism was not the way to God. He saw it much more like the Greek philosophers. It was an inner struggle. So it was a very interpersonal thing. That's why the Brethren of Common Life and things like that. He didn't see it was outward formality. The thing that you find out about Erasmus is everybody wanted to appeal to Erasmus. It's kind of like Augustine. Everybody appeals, Augustine said this, and Augustine said that, and Augustine said this. Well, in this time period, everybody wanted to say, okay, Erasmus, are you on our side or not? Well, Erasmus, during this particular time, he doesn't decry Luther. He doesn't say against Luther. So his Catholic the Catholics look at him and go, well, you must support Luther. And he's going, no. But he won't support Luther. So the Lutherans are going, so you're against Luther. And he's going, no. I'm not taking sides in this. We're just dealing with this stuff. So you're a coward. You know the truth. You should be on our side. And fortunately, he was, in certain ways, from a human way, he was smart. He stayed out of the middle of it as best he could. He said as little as humanly possible. Because the problem is he was kind of in between two camps. He saw what Luther was saying, but he didn't agree with all of what Luther was saying because he wanted to see Reformation like most of the humanists from within the church, which originally that's what Luther we're going to see wanted also. But he also held to things that he couldn't jive with Luther. So he kind of really was standing in between the two of them. But again, his big contribution that most of us can be very happy with is he started dealing the critical text of the original Greek New Testaments. And that's where you get like the Geneva Bible, King James Bible, were based on his work. Now they were updated and updated and updated. But so that was some good stuff. So that's Erasmus. He's the guy that's going to be coming in and out of the Reformation a lot. So I just wanted to make sure you knew a little bit more about him. Well, let's turn our attention now. This is in lesson 2 or chapter 2 of your notes. Because remember, we've been going through Gonzalez's book. We got to like chapter 34, 35, 36. Well, that was volume 1. Well, this is volume 2, so it starts back over. Even if you have the big single volume, it's halfway through. So this is chapter 2 of volume 2. So let's just take a few things. I'm not going to go through all the detail about Luther because we could spend weeks and months and years just talking about Luther. There's books, there's movies. Actually, the relatively recent, last 10 years movie called Luther, it's actually not a bad summary of his life.
The one with Joseph Fiennes?
I don't know who's the guy. Is that who it is? Yeah. Yeah, it's really not that bad. I mean, there's bits and pieces of it that you're kind of like, eh. But it does give a pretty nice summary of kind of how Luther had to move through his life from his early days onward. And sort of how things played out. And things get out of control in the Reformation, and Luther admits it, and we're not going to talk about it, but Luther did some pretty crazy things towards the end of his life where we would all look at, he probably would too, go, no. But some of the stuff that was not his fault, but unfortunately he gets labeled with some of it. But some of it is his fault. So again, that book or that movie is actually not too bad if you just want a little quick summary. You can read books and books. And I think Piper had a series that there was a pretty good summary of Luther's life and a few things like that. So we're just going to go through the highlights of his life, and then we'll talk about his theology a little bit more in our next lesson. So first off, Luther was, as you can tell, a calm, quiet, shy, retiring guy, very, very rarely spoke out. Yeah. If you believe that, you know nothing about Martin Luther. He was an honest man of passion and sincerity. He was very passionate, and once he set his feet to a course, it's going to take heaven to move him out of the way, because earth ain't going to move him out of the way. He is a passionate man. Though the days he lived in, strong language and over emotive language was normative, Luther kind of pushed it a little sometimes. He excelled at it. Yes, he was outstanding at extra emotive language. He uses a lot of stuff. He's a guy that really, a lot of these situations, as we've seen, we're talking about church history. History, God uses in the world to actually protect Luther or drive Luther. It's kind of like, here's all the currents and forces, and Luther's a little boat in there. And yet he's paddling as hard as he can, trying to do the right thing, but the current shifts him around that rock and then back into this inlet and over to this calm place and then zipping down the rapids again. A lot of the stuff that we're going to see in Luther's life are situations well beyond his control. Now, how many of us ever live in life that's well beyond our control? So take heart. This is how Luther's life was, and God used it. Okay? So that's kind of a thing that we always have to take away from this. God is still in charge even when it doesn't look like it, or God is in charge when we don't even know He's in charge. And a lot of times with Luther, he didn't even know what was going on around him, and God used that to protect him. Now again, that doesn't mean we're kind of some kind of puppet, but it was very interesting to see what was going on. We've mentioned before the printing press. Printing press was originally mostly in the academic circles. Well, this is the time period where the printing press gets used for more common purposes. Getting sermons, getting pamphlets, getting material out. And in Germany in particular, they used it a lot. And this was how message got spread. So it wasn't Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever the latest, in 2 years this recording will be completely outdated because Who knows what the new thing will be? But it's whatever the way that you could communicate with. I don't know about you. If you can only go 7 miles away from your normal village, you're not going to communicate very fast. But if somebody can print bills and send them out all over the place, things get going. So the printing press is going to be a tremendous driver, and Luther is going to be one of those guys who's going to take tremendous advantage of it. We also see European culture has been more nationalistic. We've already talked about that the papacy and the corruption is so obvious that they don't even care anymore. You know, when the Pope introduces, hi, look, these are my concubines and my illegitimate children. By the way, I'm giving them these lands. And you're doing that not behind the back, but right in front of everybody. Nobody can miss it. Now, there's still a good front you got to put up, and we're going to see how Luther gets hooked into this. We also see that the humanism. And what's really interesting about humanism, and this is one of those things, is they would stand back and say, you know what? Let's judge and evaluate these things. Let's look at the law. Let's be fair about it. Before, it was like, burn them, okay, you're dead. These guys affected a lot of the thinking in the secular world in particular, that if I'm going to be a wise and fair ruler, we're going to see Frederick the Wise, he's going to say, oh, he may be wrong, but let's give him a fair trial. I'm not going to condemn a man unless we give him a fair trial, which was a wonderful defense when people just say, let's go ahead and get rid of this dude. And that's going to be one of those things that all these forces are combining. Now people can read, people can write, people can understand, people have access to materials. They can say, well, was Luther right? Oh, yeah, right here, yeah. What he's saying is true. That's in the Bible. Hey, well, we're Christians. We're supposed to believe the Bible, even though we believe in a whole lot of other stuff too. So all of these forces are going to affect things. The problem we're going to see is when you're debating theology outside of something that affects people personally, how much traction do you think your argument's going to get? Not much. Yeah. Unless it affects people personally, really little traction is going to be. It's just an intellectual kind of, that's cool. I don't understand this. God's truth is truth, but we tend to operate in, if it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect the world. We see that all the time now, right? If it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect the world. And when do people get passionate about something? When it affects them, or, it impacts them, right? If it affects them personally, they get passionate about it. Well, what we're going to see is Luther is going to go and make some debates and arguments that are theologic, and he's going to get absolutely no traction on them. People are going to go, oh, okay, whatever. Later on, he's going to touch people's pocketbooks and power, and suddenly people get really interested in it. But the only way that is possible is the people see such a massive mismatch between what the Bible says, or what they believe even without much biblical understanding, and their leadership. Right? You would think that there would have been a massive rebellion by now. Well, there's been no rebellion because there's been no ability to rebel. And people still want to think the best. And people still want to try to do things that, well, let's make it simple. Let's make it easy. Let's reform, right? People have to be pushed really far and really personally before there's any rebellion. And Luther is going to be the same thing. The guy never wanted to be a rebel. He just wanted God's word to be honored and God to be honored. That was his passion. Unfortunately, it led him way, way, way down the lines that are, have reverberations today. So, that's kind of where we start. By the way, in your notes on the bottom of page 2, one of the French proverbs of the time reads, "If you want to go to hell, become a priest." That tells you what people thought of the church. That's pretty interesting. If you want to find your way to hell or going to go to hell, become a priest. That's a proverb. Okay, proverbial statements are because that's how people see it, right? That's not a good statement. That tells you the state of the church in one simple word. Now, Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. And he was named after St. Martin. Now, I don't know if this is Martin of Tours, but I suspect it probably is, because he was born on the eve of St. Martin's Day. His father was a peasant who became a miner, who then developed from there and amassed some small amount of wealth in establishing foundries. Now, notice what I just described there. His parentage in the feudal Middle Ages, would this have ever been possible to a guy who's a peasant, becomes a miner, becomes a relatively wealthy guy establishing foundries? No, that would have never happened. So just all the events that we've seen enable this guy to now have the wealth to now say, okay, Martin, I want you to improve yourself. It's kind of like the American dream type of idea. The immigrants come in and they do this, who then get their kids to here, to get their kids to here, and by 3 generations type of thing. His father is kind of doing the second generation to Luther kind of deal. I was a peasant. I'm successful. Now I want you to be even more successful than I am. So in this particular time, becoming a lawyer was a very successful and very respected path. That's what he wanted Luther to become. Unfortunately, this guy's view of how things should be run is rather medieval. Very harsh, very tyrannical type of idea. And this idea of his father's harshness, the church's harshness, school's harshness, really affects Luther's view of God as Father. I mean, if you grew up in a harsh home, your view of how God being your heavenly Father is instantaneously, whoa, if that's what God's like my dad, I don't want any part of it, right? That's a stumbling block. That's why it's so important dads be God-honoring fathers and husbands, and, that's our call, because that's what they see. And this is going to affect Luther tremendously. He does decide he's going to go study the law, and on his way home, he was at the University of Erfurt in 1501. He studies Occam, Scotus, Bonaventure, Aquinas, all these different people, so both legal and theologic, because a lot of times in those universities at that time, you graduated as a theologian. So you had to study theology as well as whatever your subject was. It's kind of like, I'm an engineer, by the way, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm a theologian, by the way, I'm also a lawyer. Kind of an idea. They studied this. He was very clearly brilliant. He wanted to learn. People loved his mind and his abilities. Some people are even jealous of it. Like, you're too smart for your own good, Martin, type of thing. So this guy was clearly an incredibly enabled person. So a lot of times people think, oh, Martin Luther was just this guy out there and he stumbled across a passage and unlocked the key to the scriptures. The guy was very well studied and learned. He worked his tail off to know God's word and study and understand all of these things. So Luther was a brilliant man, as well as a passionate man. Now in 1505, returning from home, he encounters a thunderstorm, and this is the thing that's sort of his epiphany of why he needs to go in to become a monk. Lightning bolts hit around him, and he's terrified. If you're ever in a thunderstorm, they're bad. If you're in a thunderstorm with lightning that hits near you, it's really scary. I grew up in the place where the most lightning bolts per square mile on the planet hit. So if you ever go to Clearwater, Florida, that Tampa Bay area, that is the world record most lightning bolts per square mile. And believe me, lightning's scary. You do not go out in it, especially on golf courses. People do that, though. He cries out, "Beloved Saint Anne." You can tell where Luther's state of thinking is. "I will become a monk." So he goes home and he tells his father, by the way, Dad, I'm quitting law school. I'm going to become a monk. What every father wants to hear. I busted my tail from peasant to get you to go to law school, and because of a lightning storm, you're going to become a monk. But to Luther, what did he do? He made a vow. Now you see how passionate Luther is? I made a promise. I'm going to keep it. That's a faithful man. He also was a bit rash, as he later admits. He said, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But here's a quote that John Piper has about that, and I think it's interesting. I want to read it. It's on the bottom of page 3 in your notes. It says, we see this kind of merciful providence over and over again in the history of the church, and it should protect us from the paralyzing effects of a bad decision in our past. God is not hindered in his sovereign designs from leading us, as he did Luther, out of the blunders into fruitful lives of joy. So, anybody who screwed up, made a bad decision, I probably doesn't count any of you guys in the room, but, I've made a couple in my life. God is bigger than that, so don't worry about it. Yeah, you did do the right thing, learn from it, grow, move on. God is bigger than that. He will take care of things. Yes, there probably was an easier path, maybe, but God has a way he's working stuff. So he joins the Augustinian monks, who at this particular time were the most strict monks in all the monasteries in 1505. This is July 1505. Okay, so this is 12 years before the 95 Theses. But he also has 97 Theses before this, and a whole bunch of other adventures before we get to the 95 Theses. Luther was a guy who just poured himself into it. And the Augustinians were not about to let this really smart guy get away with being anything but humble. So they put him to menial labor, all the harsh work, and he poured himself into it. As a matter of fact, according to him, he says, I indeed, a pious monk, and kept the rules of the order myself so strictly that I can say, if ever a monk gained heaven through monkery, it should have been I. Sound familiar? Like Paul, yeah, exactly. All my monastic brethren who knew me will testify of this. I would have martyred myself to death with fasting, praying, reading, and other good works had I remained among much longer. Does sound like Paul, doesn't it? If there was anything in works and deeds and sacrifices and whatever, I was it. And like Paul, he was very passionate, and like Paul, he was very educated, and like Paul, so if you notice, Luther's very Pauline-like. And also people accused Paul of being crazy, and his great learning has driven you crazy, and, you're too passionate, and all these other kinds of things. And Luther was very much like that. However, how much peace do you think Luther got about his sins being dealt with and things going, that he's got a chance with God? How much do you think? Zippo, yeah. Doesn't matter what he turned to. And he turns to study. He turns to prayer. He turns to confession. Matter of fact, Luther was so crazy about confession because remember, that was how you gained absolution of sins, confessed to the priest, and you would be absolved. Sometimes up to 6 hours a day he was in the confessional. Now, who do you think wanted to be on rotation with Martin Luther? Martin's coming to confess. Oh no, not me. He's running. I mean, the guy really was serious about this. As a matter of fact, sometimes he'd come out of the confessional and be so freaked out that he forgot something, he'd run back in and start confessing some more. That didn't help. He said, when I was a monk, I made great effort to live according to the requirements of the monastic rule. Nevertheless, my conscience could never achieve certainty, but was always in doubt, and said, you have not done this correctly. You were not contrite enough. You admitted this and omitted this in your confession. Therefore, the longer I tried to heal my uncertain, weak, and troubled conscience with human traditions, the more uncertain, weak, and troubled I continually made it. People, you can't heal yourself by doing stuff. Isn't it great that we have grace of God? And isn't it horrible to be trapped into this kind of stuff? How dark. Think about people who are trying to earn their way to God. Have great pity on them. Pray for them. because this is what Luther was going through, and it was agony to him because he was serious about it. This was not some guy who was just flopping around. He was deadly serious about what he wanted, what he needed to do. So, God was still sitting there pointing his finger at Luther. He tried mysticism for a while. Okay, well, if rigor and tradition and works and confession won't work, what about the mysticism and the personal piety? I can have a relationship. See, it wasn't all bad. They were trying to get you to have a good relationship, and then what happens? The other side is, well, how do I know I loved him enough? Did I have a close enough relationship with him enough? So, it turned into a works piety. Was I godly enough today? Did I love God enough? And he could never in his conscience realize that he had to honor and worship and love God for who he is, because all he saw was that judge, the lightning bolt God. He was going to get me because Martin Luther knew his sin. And the more he studied, because he was trying to become a doctor of theology, the more you study God's Word, doesn't it make you feel so much better that you're a good person, right? Yeah. I got a call in the middle of the night from somebody who, they said, the more I read the Bible, the worse I feel about myself. I said, good. You're getting the point. Now let's turn to Christ. That's where your salvation is. It isn't because you're a good person. You're not. You've got point 1. Now let's go to point 2. And this is how he did. Unfortunately, he was pretty much paralyzed by this. So, of course, people said, well, if you can't do it as a monk, why don't you do it as a priest? And so his superior said, why don't you become a priest? Remember, monks didn't become priests very often. And so they said, well, why don't you become a priest? Unfortunately, he was so terrified of God that he was holding transubstantiation. Remember, the body and blood of Christ. His first communion service, he froze. He says, I can't, this is now the body and blood of Christ. How am I, unworthy Martin Luther, holding the body and blood of Christ and handing it out? The guy was so terrified he froze and couldn't finish the Mass. Of all the high crimes you can commit as a monk, as a priest, that's it. Because the Eucharist, the Mass, that's the central element of worship in a Catholic service. So the one thing you have to be able to do is that. That's the one thing he couldn't do. Totally freaked him out, embarrassed his father. It's quite amazing. So, passion, conviction, just scared to death of what's going on.
How many years he continued this way?
Well, until he started at the university and started teaching through Psalms and Romans, and finally got what Romans 1:17 actually meant. So it was a number more years after he became a priest.
5 years?
Probably. Yeah, probably around 4 or 5 years. He was, his whole life up to this point. But until just before he nailed up the 97 Theses, which that was, he got his doctorate of theology in 1512. So right after that. So yeah, about 4 or 5 years. So he was pretty convicted for quite a long time. So they said, all right, you can't cut it as a priest. You don't work as a monk. How about be a professor? You're not cut out for being a monk. You're not cut out being a pastor or a priest. So go be an academic. So where do? They ship him off to the University of Wittenberg. And it was a newly founded university, and so he's supposed to get his doctorate of theology. Very high, very prestigious, very well-studied guy. And he starts learning and studying. They were hoping that, like Jerome, because Jerome was, we remember way back we talked about Jerome, the guy he was tortured by all of the stuff that he knew he couldn't do, and they said he found some solace when he studied. Well, they were thinking that maybe Luther could find some solace when he studies. No, Luther doesn't, because he starts studying the Psalms and lecturing on the Psalms. And when he gets to Psalm 71, he gets to verse 2. It says, in your righteousness deliver me and rescue me. Oh, wait a second. God's righteousness in Luther's mind All he demanded was judgment. How in the world, in your righteousness, are you going to rescue me? It didn't make any sense to him. And eventually, through his study and continuing to chase down stuff, he was led to Romans 1:17, the righteousness of God. And it says, for in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. That was the verse that he kind of went, ding, 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 ding. Now I understand what in the world is going on. What is happening here? And I'll just read what Luther says. He says, at last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the words, namely, it is the righteousness of God is revealed as is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. Romans 1:17. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. Here I felt altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through the open gates. He finally understood that it was God's grace and mercy through faith that the righteous shall live by that. And it was in that righteousness, God's righteousness, that matches back is what is going to deliver and rescue you. Back in Psalm 71. So he finally understood it wasn't works, it wasn't anything he could do, it wasn't God's judgment. Then guess what happens? The scriptures are completely unlocked. Now God is the one who is punishing sin, yes, but it was through his Son who gave us his righteousness. It's kind of amazing. See? So he finally got it. And we'll talk a little bit more about his theology later. And it says, the whole scriptures gained new meaning. From that point on, the phrase, the justice of God, no longer filled me with hatred, but rather became unspeakably sweet by the virtue of a great love. Pretty amazing. But look how long Luther struggled and fought to come to that realization that we take for granted. If we learn nothing else out of the Reformation, learn that. That sweetness that God has given us. Kind of amazing. So, Luther the troublesome monk. Well, Luther just started saying, hey, I know the gospel now. I'm going to just preach it and teach it. Cool. A lot of his colleagues started going, Luther, you're right. A lot of the people in the area, wow, Luther, you're right. Even Frederick the Wise, who's the leader in the area, wow, maybe this guy's got something. What happens when you get truth, and that truth is in opposition to everything you see around you, or a lot of what you see around you? People start going, what does this imply, right? See, this is the exegesis that you now understand truth, and then there's that thing called application, and then you start seeing the application and going, oh, wait a second, how then should we be living? See, a lot of people like to stop at the exegesis and say, woo, I got truth. If you stop there, you miss the whole point of why you bothered studying in the first place. There's now application. Unfortunately, it gets really scary. Because when you are against almost 1,000 years of tradition and thought and corruption and all of the powers that be, and you can see it and everybody else can, that's not going to look so good. So, Luther says, what do I need to do? And his superior said, well, why don't you go to Rome and just see how Rome is, and maybe you'll calm down a little bit. And so he makes a pilgrimage to Rome, looks around, goes, this kind of looks cool. And then he starts poking, like poor old Luthers want to do. He starts looking around, asking questions. Wizard of Oz, don't look behind the man behind the curtain, kind of thing. Well, he looks behind the curtain, and he finds out the priest, the pope, the cardinals, the bishops are like all in it for themselves. And they are fleecing the people right and left. And he's kind of comes back sick to his stomach. And very, very convinced now, well, I just thought this was a theologic thing and things were a little off. He's like, no, this is rotten at the core. We need some reformation. Now, is he saying let's break from the Catholic Church, let's cause a rebellion? No, he's just like, we need to get things going in the right direction. So in 1512, he gets his doctorate, and then after this visit to Rome, he writes the 97 propositions or theses that challenge the traditional theology of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, if you happen to be a Roman Catholic Church that doesn't really give a rip about theology, what's your reaction as the Pope going to be? Whatever. Because you're worried about getting money and building Sistine chapels and, all that kind of stuff, and fighting as a political prince. That's what you're interested to do. So Luther thinks he's going to challenge the church, and they just ignore him. It doesn't end there, though. There's this Dominican monk. Remember, he's Augustinian. The Dominican monk, a gentleman named John Tetzel. This dude was probably one of the most unscrupulous con men of the age. Unfortunately, he was really good at it. And what's the thing about a good con man? They con, which means a con man means confidence man. They gain your confidence. You'll do anything. That's what con means, not bad. Con mean conscious man. They're confidence man. They're going to gain your confidence. And so Luther goes after this guy, and he has these wonderful things. He's the jingle guy. He's the what's the latest jingle? And if you buy this soap, all these girls are going to come get you. And if you drive that car, these guys are going to be. He's the medieval or Reformation sales dude. And nothing wrong with sales. Just he wasn't very honest about them. He says if you purchase an indulgence, the cleaner than you came out of baptism and cleaner than Adam was before the fall. Who wants to be clean? Come on, buy this. His most famous jingle: as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Okay, remember this is one of his popular ones. So all you got to do is go pling, and the soul from purgatory springs. I mean, it probably sounds better in German. I don't know, or Italian, whatever he was speaking in. Luther goes after him, and unfortunately, Tetzel's really convincing. Luther doesn't make much headway against him. You would think Luther with the scriptures in the Bible, people are going, no, my grandma gets out of purgatory. It's only going to cost me this, and that's it. He sold me, right? And he's such a nice guy. He's not mean. Matter of fact, the Pope's going to help out, right? And Luther's going, no. Well, if you're an ignorant person who doesn't have any idea of what the scriptures actually say and you're not a theologian, who's going to win that debate? Tetzel. Isn't it frustrating when you try to use the Bible and people just go, they're a really nice guy? I don't care. They may be a really nice guy, but that's not the Bible. Tetzel has a lot of advantages. And Luther sees these indulgences far more than the average person. The average person, that might be corrupt. It's just kind of the way it is. He sees this at the heart of God's free sovereign grace. This is an attack on God's grace, all right? So he sees beyond it's a little corruption. He's saying, here's the theology behind it. You have just taken God's free grace that's given to all men, and you're putting it up for sale. And so he takes a different attack. He writes the 95 Theses. In a couple of weeks, we'll be celebrating the 499th anniversary. Next year is the 500th anniversary of this event. And in some of them, he kind of asks some really challenging questions. In Theses 82, he says, they ask, example, why does the Pope liberate everyone from purgatory for the sake of love. Why does he not do it for the sake of love, a most holy thing, and because of the supreme necessity of their soul? This would be morally the best of all reasons. Meanwhile, he redeems innumerable souls for money, a most perishable thing, which is to build St. Peter's Church, a very minor purpose. How many people you think like that one? But there's more. Christians should be taught that the Pope would be willing, as he ought, if necessity should arise, to sell the Church of St. Peter to give to his own money to the many of those whom the pardoned merchants conjure money. Instead of taking money from these people, he should sell everything he has and give to these people that they're ripping off because they're the poor. All right. Now, we've gone from theology to now you're making this personal preacher, right? You've heard that one before? I love hearing you, preacher, and now you're making things personal. I don't want to listen to that kind of stuff. Well, this is what he does. You're making it personal. And this was on October 31st, 1517. Publishers, of course, then start taking it, printing press, sending it out to people. Erasmus then sarcastically says, Luther has committed two unpardonable crimes. He has attacked the Pope's crown, his power, and the monks' bellies. If you notice here, it has nothing to do with theology. It has to you've affected their well-being and the Pope's power. Those are two unpardonable crimes. What happens to the 97 Theses theology stuff? Why don't we hear all about that? They didn't care. This they care about. But Luther did have a good theological reason why he attacked it. So he attacked it not from theology, though that was the basis. He attacked it in practice with the theology behind it. Does that make sense? So sometimes you have to deal with something that people gets their attention to be able to enter into a discussion. The discussion itself doesn't ring with most folks. Well, the Pope, Maximilian, who's the emperor at this time, wants Pope Leo X to intervene. Pope goes, whatever. It's just the rantings of an upstart monk. They'll go away. Sounds like Gamaliel's counsel to the Sanhedrin, right? These are just a bunch of raving guys. If it's not real, it's going to die down. But if it is, you might be fighting against God. So just ignore it. Isn't that the best way the politicians shake off scandal? Just ignore it long enough to people loses their attention. In this particular case, God is going to permit the Pope to ignore it long enough that it takes hold, as opposed to go away. See, this is the difference. Most of the time things go away, but in God's providence, this takes hold. So, I'm going to skip the Diet of Augsburg, except to say that the Pope sends one of his legates, the guys who are, sort of ambassador kind of guys, who is a cardinal, who has a lot of power, and his primary mission is to get the Germans on his side. And his secondary mission is to get Luther to shut up, recant. So this guy isn't really caring too much about Luther except, get him to shut up. And Luther, by this time, sort of says, hey, I've got Philip Melanchthon. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. I've got Frederick here. If I die, if something goes wrong with me, I know other people know the truth. We've got other scholars here. We've got people who believe. So if something happens to me, the truth will continue. So I'm not worried too much about it. He argues with Cajetan, and he knows that this guy has the authority to declare him a heretic, arrest him, and kill him. Okay? They kind of kill heretics. Now we just print new books and have TV shows for them. There they killed him. He argues about the wrongness of indulgences and about the people who are going to take sacraments need to have it by faith. They argue, nothing happens. Cajetan's a very bright man. However, Luther matches him. And Cajetan eventually goes, This dude is not just the rantings of a crazy little monk. This guy is smart, dangerous, and very serious. We need to start thinking about him in a little bit different terms. Cajetan gives permission to Luther to write a treatise on his arguments, and they say, well, yeah, we'll give those to the Pope, which, where that went, over on the shelf somewhere. It gets lost in the bureaucracy. Eventually, Cajetan can't beat Luther, and he finally says, return or recant no more. Okay, I can't beat you, so I'm just going to tell you to recant. Isn't that the standard argument? You're wrong. Why? You're wrong. You're just wrong. That's usually what happens. Unfortunately, a little monk from Wittenberg just beat a cardinal. Bad, bad, bad. Luther ends up with arguing with a professor named John Eck. Remember I was telling you about Eck? Well, there's two Ecks, actually. This is John Eck. There's going to be another Eck. He was a professor at Ingolstadt. He opposes Luther's views. And again, I think I mentioned this, that Eck is going to argue mostly church canon law. He's not arguing Scripture, but he's going to argue mostly church tradition and canon law, and Luther's going to argue Scripture. It's like, heavyweight boxers going at each other. I mean, this guy's not a dummy. This guy's a very, very smart, very learned man, knows his stuff, good debater, so's Luther. Eventually, though, he gets Luther to agree to a scriptural argument that has been previously declared heretical by John Huss. And the Council of Constance, remember we talked about the Council of Constance? So if he gets Luther to agree on a scriptural argument that's already been condemned, and Luther backs it, he self-condemns himself as a heretic. So again, this guy's not dummy. So you just agreed with that? That's Scripture? You agreed with it? Well, that was Huss's argument. He was a heretic. You are too. So if you can't beat him, trick him. And he got Luther on that particular area. So that means that Luther has two choices. Say the popes and councils have no power and authority, or recant. And what's his third option? Break. Sorry, I can't deal with this anymore. I can't go. So he then realizes that to hold his arguments and stay in the church is no longer an option. He has to leave the church. So he basically burns his bridges. And I'm going to summarize this because Luther does a lot of other things. But ultimately, Charles I of Spain is the guy who gets elected the Holy Roman Emperor, who becomes Charles V. So Charles I of Spain becomes Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick the Wise had been elected the guy of Germany, the sort of ruler of Germany, and he turned it down. Smart man. If you're ever elected anything that you don't want, turn it down. Or they'll go chase you out of the city and drag you back in and make you the bishop, right? He gets turned down. And Luther ends up at Worms, and this is where we're going to stop. He is a guy who is going to have to burn his bridges. And I'm going to pick this up next week, since we're going to talk about Luther's theology, since we're out of time for this week. I don't want to rush over this. But this is like the turning point, the breaking point in the Reformation. Up to this point, Luther's done everything he can to stay in the church, to argue in the church, to be faithful in the church, to do anything he can to do the right thing. And this is where he's going to be, do I follow God or men? And this is where the break is. So we're going to stop right here, bottom page 11 of your notes, and we'll pick up at Luther at Worms. So that's where we're going to pick up this next lesson, and then we'll continue on into his theology.